Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Saffron Woodcraft and I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth event in the IGP's Soundbites series for the spring term. So today I'd like to welcome Professor Penny Bernstock. Penny's going to be talking about the urgent need for new models of affordable housing in the UK. Penny's talk is going to draw on her long-term research about regeneration and affordable housing in East London. And specifically, she will be sharing some lessons from housing in London's Olympic Park. Until recently, Penny was the director of the Centre of East London Studies at the University of East London, which led research on the impacts of the Olympic legacy for over a decade. We're particularly lucky to have Penny with us today because she's both an academic and an activist. So she's very concerned with putting the findings of rigorous research into practice and into policy. Penny's currently Professor of Urban and Community Studies at the University of West London, where she's exploring the impact of housing poverty on educational attainment. Penny's co-chair of Citizens UK Newham Olympic Legacy Strategy Group, and she sits on the Academic Advisory Board for the Institute of Community Studies in East London. Penny, welcome to the IGP. Really delighted to have you with us. I will give you the floor.
Okay, thank you so much for that welcome, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come today and talk a bit about affordable housing and the urgent need for new models on the Olympic Park. So I'm going to start by just kind of introducing why I think there's an issue. So when we won the bid to host the Games in 2005, there was huge optimism about the legacy and the potential that London would do something different. And this was despite evidence from other host cities that mega events tended to result in displacement and gentrification. However, over time, it's become clear that we've not honoured those legacy commitments. And in 2018, I joined forces with Telco to begin to lobby for a more inclusive legacy and to get things back on track. And I think it's important to say that for our membership, housing and homelessness in East London is the key concern. And it has always been. I grew up in East London and housing has always been a problem, and it continues to be a problem. And the current ways in which we respond to this problem are probably exacerbating rather than resolving the problem. So, and I think it's fair to say that the Olympic Park cannot solve East London's housing crisis, but it could make a much better contribution. And the story of affordable housing so far is one of cuts and compromises. And this means that by 2023, of the 4,444 homes that will be built on the park, just 582 will be genuinely affordable. And the reason that that's a big problem will, I hope, become apparent as I give my presentation. And that's why I think what I'm suggesting today is that, in fact, let's stop tinkering at the kind of edges of policy and let's go for something really bold for the last two neighbourhoods on the park, Pudding Mill and Rick Roberts Way. And, you know, I know that this speaks to people that are interested in inclusive economies. And I think that inclusive economies have to have housing at the centre of anything that is going to enable people to live secure livelihoods and have an existence where they're not in huge debt or living in inadequate housing. So we need to think about housing and employment together. And we need to think about solutions that will respond to both of those things, particularly in terms of how we build back better. And I also want to say that yesterday's budget was actually very, very disappointing, that once again, more stimulus to prop up the housing market and a failure to speak to the hundreds of thousands of people that would have been living through hell as we've been living in a lockdown for, you know, large parts of the last year. So I think that makes housing all the more important. I'm going to start by just kind of reminding people, taking them back to that moment in 2005 when we won the bid, just to kind of give the kind of excitement that was there at that time. So just going to show this short clip from a film that Telco we made together.
Legacy.
The International Olympic Committee has the honor of announcing that
the Games of the 30th Olympiad in 2012 are awarded to the city of... They say that
Just checking the slides are sharing. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the housing legacy. I'm going to be thinking a bit about housing need, and I'm going to be thinking about, well, okay, what can we learn from what's happened and what can we do differently? So, you know, as I've highlighted in the film, the key organising themes of the Olympics when we won the bid was this kind of optimism that we were going to do something very different in London. And there were a number of themes that were very, very clearly marked out in that bid. One of the themes was around deprivation. Another was about the world in one city, and that was speaking to the very diverse and multicultural population. And then there was a very clear theme around legacy and the idea that the regeneration of East London was going to be at the heart of what happened. And in a walk around the park, we can see that something has definitely happened on the park, and there's lots of exciting things going on, and there's a good growth zone and lots of things happening. But in terms of housing, we're not where we need to be. So this is a picture here, and we can see this is a charter that was signed with Ken Livingstone, John Biggs, who was a GLA Assembly member, and is now the Mayor for Tower Hamlets, and Sebastian Coe. And this was a charter, so citizens here, we can see, have played a very, very important role in trying to lead a kind of community agenda for change. And so they were not sure whether they were going to back the bid, and they backed the bid in exchange for some very clear commitments around what would be left if what would be achieved. So one of those things was 50% affordable housing, and another was that there would be community land trusts on the park, and at least 20 community land trusts were promised. And the charter here, was signed, and the community backed the bid in good faith that that would happen. Across that time, 2005 to 2020, much has happened, and we've had 3 London mayors. And in different ways, they've all had a different contribution to kind of how the housing legacy has taken shape. So Ken Livingstone was very much kind of convinced that we could achieve 50% affordable housing, but there were never any formal plans. Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, cut the levels of affordable housing on the park quite substantially. And Sadiq Khan, although he's made a commitment to reinstate those levels of affordable housing and increase them, and he won on the backing of saying 50% affordable housing on public land, I'm afraid that hasn't happened on the Olympic Park. So I think there's a job still to be done there. So I think another really important thing to think about when we think about the Olympic Park is, well, why is housing so important? And housing is so important because East London has some of the highest levels of housing need in the country. And you can see on this slide that I'm showing currently that in fact Newham has the highest number of people on their housing waiting lists of anywhere in England, 27,635. And at the same time, supply, and we can see supply in 1994 and 2019. So we're seeing a decline in the levels of affordable housing, local authority housing in particular, and it's pretty high waiting lists. And the figures in brackets after 27,000 highlight the number of families that are living in insanitary or overcrowded conditions. And sadly, again, Newham tops that for the whole of England, has the highest number of households living in unsatisfactory or overcrowded conditions. And if you move on to the final column, that final column is giving you an idea of the number of new properties becoming available every year. So if you imagine there's 27,635 households on the waiting list, and there's less than 800 properties becoming available in any one year. And this means that translates into quite a considerable experience of housing misery, of families living 7 to a 1-bedroom flat, bidding and bidding and really getting nowhere. And so on top of people in these boroughs living in very, very poor housing, there's also a big, very big issue that's become bigger over the last 5 or 6 years of displacement, of households having to make the choice between leaving the area if they want to find adequate accommodation or staying in inadequate accommodation. And again, so if we look at Newham, it's got, it accounts for 1/8 of the London boroughs, but 1/4 of all those people being moved out of borough are actually from the 4 legacy boroughs. And Paul Watt's work has really captured the impact on young people, on young mothers, on women generally, of what that means to be forced out of borough. So displacement and housing precarity is a huge reality. So what we have then is a really very big crisis. So now we need to think, well, okay, what happens on the park becomes really important, because if you have this huge housing crisis and you have this commitment to regenerate the area for the entire benefit of everyone that lives there, the starting point has to be the needs of those communities. And I'm afraid that hasn't been the starting point, as I'll show as I go through. I think it's also important to think about the wider kind of policy context in terms of what's happened since 2005. And the first thing is the Olympic budget itself. And this is a thing that's been found in so many host cities, was underestimated, and it increased, to such an extent that more and more debts were accrued. And so part of the problem the LLDC has is that it has to repay those debts. And so it's having to balance kind of a range of tensions, if you like, around how it moves forward. There's also been, as we know, it's very well documented that the stadium has cost so much more money than as it was expected. And again, that's another kind of tension. And East Bank was a scheme that came to the table, if you like, much later on. In terms of housing, we won the games in a boom. We then had a credit crunch. We then had a massive housing boom in London as a result of the credit crunch, where people were, seeing London as a kind of safety deposit box internationally. And now we have a kind of pandemic, and we're not quite sure how that's going to play out. Although interestingly, we can see London is losing some of its population, and that could be good news for housing demand. The other kind of layer of issues that's kind of at the context of what's happened is austerity urbanism. And so there's been cuts to the housing funding, there's been caps on housing benefit, and there's been a model of housing. So we've shifted what affordable housing is since 2005. And in particular in 2012, affordable housing was redefined as a product rather than linked to any kind of income. And so it was enough, something could be called affordable housing if it was a discount. So it could be a £600,000 property with a 20% discount, and that would be constituting affordable housing. So I think that's the kind of backdrop of what we're going to be thinking about. So in terms of the affordable housing legacy, I think there's 3 dimensions. The first is planning gain. The second is the transformation of East Village into housing. And the third is the 5 neighbourhoods. So I'm going to talk about each of them quite briefly in turn, because what I want to spend more time on is thinking about, well, what do we do differently? And one of the pieces of research that I did a couple of years ago was to look at planning gain. And I went back to every planning application since 2000 to 2018. And I did an observation of the LLDC Planning Committee to try and understand the role of planning gain, which is seen as a really important dimension of any kind of regeneration, of how you capture value for local communities, if you like. So the assumption is that state investment will lead to, the state invests in land, it revalorises land, that leads to rising land values. In turn, private sector comes in and invests, and then the state can capture value for local communities. And I'm just going to move into, I realise I'm in the wrong view, to go through. So this is a table that's based on my analysis of planning applications since 2012 and 2017. And I've highlighted, because I don't want to kind of bore you with the detail, but it is quite significant that in fact, across that period, just 19% of affordable housing was levered through the planning process. So in other words, the state has invested billions, in fact, on the Olympic Park, and yet it's really not able to capture much value for local communities. And, the planners themselves, had spend lots of time in detailed negotiations to try and capture benefits, but the developers will mainly say that their viability will be impacted if they make a substantial contribution. So this suggests, in fact, that model of kind of the growth dependent planning paradigm, if you like, is very flawed as a way of achieving regeneration that's going to be beneficial to low income communities. And I think, if we look at the last column here, 52-48, what this is saying is that 52% of housing that comes through the planning process across that period was for social rent, and 48% was intermediate housing. And it's intermediate housing, the type of intermediate housing on the park I really want to draw your attention to. And also want to kind of just, before I move on to think about that, just a bit about some of the planning tensions that happen through the committee. And for the developers at the LLDC, they would argue that they're in a position of having development or no development. Do you have development with no affordable housing, or do you wait and get development with 50% affordable housing? Viability has become a very, very big issue, where viability is used as a rationale for not making contributions. And the idea is that, in fact, if you don't give planning approval, then you're going to kind of impact on development. And it's quite interesting. One planner said to me, it's ironic with developers, they've got one viability, one kind of statement of profit for the bank, another for the developers, so how do they get planning permission? How do they get funding if it's not actually profitable? But this is a huge problem. And then there's the need to make affordable housing targets. And so this, as I will suggest, is achieved by compromising and providing housing that isn't affordable really, but it's affordable in name, and that's a way of ticking a box. And I think, so there's a series of compromises that seem to be going on, and another is about off-site or on-site affordable housing. So one of the things that I observed through the planning process was that lots of developers would be happy to make a much larger contribution to affordable housing if it was nowhere near their housing. And so what you get is a trend to off-site affordable housing, which is a classic case of social exclusion through policy. And for people sitting in local authority councils, they might say, well, okay, do we have more affordable housing, and we've got thousands of people on our list somewhere else, or do we have it on the park? So those are some of the tensions. I want to really draw our attention today to the massive contribution of intermediate housing, and particularly on the park as it's manifesting itself. So, for example, Chobham Manor, which is the first neighbourhood, if you wanted to buy a property there through shared ownership, you require an income of 73,000. So that's the top decile of income. And the average nurse earns 36,000, a teacher earns 32,000, a London living wage worker earns 20,962, and local household incomes in the legacy boroughs range from 23 to 29,000. And so what are these? What does it mean? And I think the trend to intermediate housing tends to be shared ownership housing. And boroughs like Camden have actually decided to ban shared ownership as a product in that area because they know it's just not affordable. Over time, it's become clear that it's in London in particular, the most of the people buying shared ownership are in the top income deciles. And I've got this chart here, which is it's from the ONS for this year, and it's looking at the kind of deciles of income, household deciles of income. So what you can see is, in fact, decile 10, the wealthiest 10% earn, around 80,000. So in other words, a one-bedroom property, shared ownership, is being targeted at people in the top decile of income. And so this, it couldn't be more problematic that austerity urbanism is meant to be about cuts, but in fact it's not cuts at all. It's using money in a very different way. And so that the housing subsidy are switching up whilst the people at the kind of bottom are finding it harder and harder to find access to decent housing. And another way of thinking about that is one of the things through talking to lots of people in East London, there is something called choice-based lettings, which is again a kind of market kind of model of thinking about how you access council housing. So we met families that had been bidding for 10 years to get a property, and they couldn't understand why they would bid, you know, every week, every month for these different properties, and they would be unlucky. But of course, as we saw from the data earlier, if there's 27,000 people on the list and there's 700 properties, you're one of many, many families bidding. The other picture I think I wanted to show you because it's about intermediate housing. So if you wanted to access shared ownership intermediate housing, the barriers to accessing that housing they're negligible. If you have the resources, you can probably kind of progress to buying a shared ownership house, you know, whenever you want, if you've got the income. And so I think it kind of highlights that tension that we're building housing because it ticks a box, intermediate housing, but it's not really whose need is it actually serving. So I'm just aware of time and just thinking about East Village, which was the first project on the park, first affordable housing project, and in a way a demonstration project for mixed communities. And it was a demonstration project because on the kind of tin, it's like 49% affordable housing. So it looks like it's a really, really high percentage of affordable housing. But when you begin to break it down, in fact, just under half of that is for social rent, which is mapped against local incomes, whereas the remainder is intermediate rent, which requires an income of around 48,000, or shared ownership, which is much more exclusive. And if we look at the pie chart here, this is data from Triathlon Homes. And what we're really concerned about, that it provides some kind of insight into the ethnic breakdown of who is living in shared ownership housing. We can see that Black Caribbeans make up 2% of the shared owners, Black African 2%. Whereas in fact they are more like 8, 9, 10% of the populations of the legacy boroughs, so greatly underrepresented, whereas white British in fact are underrepresented in the legacy boroughs and overrepresented as shared ownership owners here. So that's a concern in terms of intermediate housing. I think the other thing to say about East Village is that it's a new model of housing. QDD own the private part and Triathlon own the public part. And in fact, they have Triathlon Homes is a public-private venture that has reported a £9 million profit in 2018. So in fact, they're making quite a lot of profit from this affordable housing scheme, which doesn't seem to be then invested back for local communities. And I think, so for me, I think there's questions about East Village of what could you do? Are there any easy policy changes that could make that more affordable? And I think if we looked at the intermediate housing at East Village and said, actually, the housing has to be mapped against local incomes, then I think that would be a much better outcome for people then they would be able to access the intermediate housing. So I think, you know, half of that intermediate housing not being affordable is a problem. And I think from a policy point of view, we could go and say, actually, we think that we need a different model here. I'm not clear why they need to be generating such a huge profit. Could that profit be transferred into making the housing more affordable? But currently, as it maps to the market, it isn't affordable. So Chobham Manor is the first neighbourhood on the park, and I've been doing some research at Chobham Manor, and it's quite interesting because on the one hand, it has attracted a kind of pioneer gentrification group of people that really want to make this a very nice place, and they're committed to investing, and they might have been former head teachers or people with quite a lot of skills that want to come and live in the area. But on the other hand, there's lots and lots of empty properties here, where they're used as pied-à-terres or they're used as safety deposit boxes. And this is a kind of another contradiction, if you like, of the model that we have. So we have, you know, all of these families living outside of the park in poor housing, and we have empty properties on the park, reflecting the contradictions of the current housing model that we live with. And these people that have purchased these properties have benefited from the massive state investment, and that massive state investment was agreed to because of the legacy benefits that were anticipated. Now, Eastwick and Sweetwater is a neighbourhood that is going to be, it's near to completion. I suppose this is the second neighbourhood. And again, this has been very much kind of part of a political football. It was originally going to have 48% and 43% affordable housing. That was cut to 30%. But following lobbying from Citizens UK, Telco, we're really pleased to say that there's going to be another 151 affordable houses here, which will make a massive, massive difference to those people living in housing need. The other development, fourth development, East Bank, Stratford Waterfront. Again, we have been very keen to lobby here around the affordable housing, because although it's labelled as having 35% genuinely affordable housing, in fact, it's all shared ownership housing. And we think it's really, really significant because East Bank is going to be a prime location. It's likely that it will be very, very expensive over time, that the prices will go up substantially. It will be something similar to South Bank. And we've suggested that in South Bank, the Coin Street development was built, and the Coin Street development was built to protect the interests of low-income communities and to make sure that there was an ongoing presence. And so we think that we need something on East Bank similar to Coin Street that would really guarantee affordable housing in perpetuity. So, and then this is the final development, Pudding Mill and Rick Roberts Way. And so this is a kind of slide from their consultation, which again suggests more of the same: 56% private sale, 12% shared ownership, and just 12% London affordable rent. But, you know, at this point, I think we need to draw a line, and rather than say, well, actually, let's have another 10 or 20% affordable housing, but to actually say, actually, I think if we're really going to do something meaningful on the park, and we haven't done that so far, let's do something really, really different on these last two neighbourhoods. And let's have cooperative housing, and let's have community land trust housing, and let's have social rented housing. And I'd suggest that what we need is actually a social affordable housing zone, that we don't have a balance. We forget about mix, because in order to address the urgent needs, we need to use this last opportunity to do something really substantially different. So 100% inclusive housing zone, community land trust housing, cooperative housing, public housing for social rent, with new forms of governance that would be affordable in perpetuity, and that really begin to pilot and new forms of investment, and to act as a demonstration project going forward, so that in fact it's a place where people come from other parts of the country and other parts of the world to say, what happened on the Olympic Park? What did they do that was different? So just to kind of say a bit about the CLT and why the CLT model would be particularly kind of attractive here. A CLT is a charity that owns land and property for the benefit of the community and the people living or working there. And the purpose is to create community asset ownership for the benefit of present and future generations. So this ownership of community assets is a resource for people to steward rather than speculation on the market. So it's about taking housing and taking land out of the market and having something that will remain affordable in perpetuity. And the focus of the housing is on use value rather than exchange value. And the model can work for rent or sale. And so it might be worth me just saying something about, well, what's happened to the CLT homes on the park? And it's really quite an interesting story just to share, in a sense, quite a frustrating story, but an interesting story. So in 2005, when London won the bid and signed up to the CLT homes, there were no CLT homes in London, in fact. But the LLDC said, okay, well, if you can develop a pilot project and demonstrate that it can work from a pilot project, we will have a CLT on the park. And so St Clement's, which is the first CLT in London, did that. And it did demonstrate that, in fact, it could work. It could be a model for affordable housing that worked. And so from the St Clement's model, in fact, there's many more schemes that have developed. So the irony is that we've got lots of CLT homes in London as a result, an unintended consequence, if you like, of the CLT that was planned for the park, but still no CLT on the park. And so there was going to be 20 CLT homes at Chobham, and then that changed to being 20 at Eastwick and Sweetwater. And the details of that are still not confirmed. And we have, in my role as co-chair of the Olympic Strategy Group, asked for meetings and an update. And we've provided information to the LLDC on a possible kind of model and how we can work with them. So it's really, really quite frustrating that hasn't happened. And so I think for me, the CLT could offer so much to what can happen on the park. And I'm just going to show you a clip from the film that we looked at earlier, which shows the benefits of the CLT homes. So
number of things we need to do. We obviously need to build more homes, but we need to have a model which provides people the opportunity to get a property on a median income.
I've got no problem with having more expensive housing being built here, as long as we've got the council housing, genuinely affordable, so housing that we need, and we're just not getting it.
So what I would like to see is a meaningful conversation, a different kind of conversation about new models of regeneration and housing development. Think about a role for community-led land trusts, thinking about the role of housing co-ops, thinking about more and different ways to provide genuinely affordable housing at social rent.
We agreed that if the Olympics did come, to do an urban community land trust in London. The big difference with the community land trust is that we're selling at roughly a third of the open market price because we're basing the homes on local incomes. So if somebody moves out, they can't sell on the open market, but technically they have to sell it back to us or to a family that we find. So these homes will always be affordable for local people.
I have lived in this area now for around 17 years, and probably unfortunately the value of the flat rose very quickly, an awful lot quicker than my wages would ever rise, and I found myself living in a one-bedroom flat with 2 children who were growing day by day, a boy and a girl, and it became increasingly unsustainable.
It would be very good to see on the Olympic Park, every time there's a housing development, that we have community land trust homes as part of the intermediate provision.
You either decide
sorry, I'm having a problem here.
No problem, Penny. Perhaps you'd like to carry on with the
Yeah, okay. So yes, to come to my conclusion then, I think that what we can see is that we need new kinds of solutions. We can't carry on as we are. And I think there's a really strong case for putting me on Rick Roberts' way to become a demonstration project for 100% affordable housing. And I think East London has a very long history of pioneering affordable housing with Beacon Tree Estate, with the Boundary Estate. And in fact, now we've pioneered Community Land Trust, the very first one also in East London. We had a cooperative on the park. And so I think there's a really, really strong case for doing something very, very different. And it would tie with the good growth zone and really to do something much more bottom up and meaningful for local communities. But I think we also do need lots more genuinely low-cost social rent housing. So I think community land trust housing itself is one part of an overall solution, along with more social rented housing, along with cooperative housing. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Penny. That was fantastic. That was such a rich and detailed talk that gives us so much to think about. I mean, I think you've captured the complexity and the tensions that emerge from planning gain, the lack of transparency around the provision of affordable housing, and the problems which the problems that go around the terminology of affordability, and affordability not being linked to people's actual experience and actual incomes. I wonder if I could just start by putting to you a couple of the questions that are emerging from the audience, and then we'll go to our panel. So starting with a question from my colleague, Jackie McGlade. Jackie is asking, do you have a way of targeting areas that could become community land trusts? So do you find a lot of land speculation in East London, which prevents these community land trusts from taking off? And do we not need a type of compulsory purchase as a mechanism to get land trusts started?
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of land in East London. In fact, Newham is one of the largest landowners. It has one of the largest banks of land. So I think, and in fact, they have just given some land. So I think there is land that is available. And I think because it's a community land trust, it does need to come also from the community. And in fact, there's
Oh, have we lost Penny? Unfortunately, I think we may have lost Penny. Are we having a technical issue here? I think so. Okay. While we're trying to reconnect with Penny, we are lucky enough to have some of Penny's colleagues from Telco on the panel with us. So I'm wondering if I could instead put that question, Jackie's question, to Emmanuel Gatura, who's here with us, and also Paul Reagan. Emmanuel, would you like to take that question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think there is real scope for using compulsory purchase orders on land that is being banked, because we have a housing crisis in London, and we've got land. And I think one of the things that we've asked the Mayor of London to do actually is to use his mayoral powers to do that. We do tend to target areas where we have members. The East London Citizens Organisation is across all the Olympic boroughs, and as well as Redbridge and Barking and Dagenham. And actually, we are talking to several local authorities, including Newham Council, around community land trust sites, or sites they could actually put aside for community land trust. In terms of the numbers, because I've seen the other question there as well, in terms of the scale, just to give you an idea of the St. Clement's was 23 out of about 240. So 23 CLT homes out of about 240 development. And I think in her talk, Penny mentioned 20 homes that are earmarked for the Olympic Park. There were actually 100 promised under Boris, as Boris Johnson as the Mayor of London when this was initiated. There were 100 CLT homes that were promised on the Olympic Park. Local authorities like Redbridge, which is not a kind of Olympic host borough in that sense, have actually committed to numbers up to 250 community land trust homes. So the scale is sort of on the up, but it tends to be very small in comparison to the kind of broader, wider developments. And where we find land, we then, with our member organizations, the church, the mosque, the school, because as you know, we are losing good teachers in London, and the people who have been at the front line of the pandemic actually can't afford, most of them can't afford to stay here. And so we do then try to target working in collaboration where we can with the local authorities and sometimes also with the developers.
That's fantastic, thank you. There's lots of great questions coming in, and Penny is back with us, so I'd like to move on to some different questions. A question here from Paul Watt. One thing which emerges strongly is how the term affordable housing is utterly bankrupt. Any thoughts? Penny, can I put that question to you? You're on mute, Penny.
Yeah, this is a key demand for us, that in fact that, you know, we cannot describe anything as affordable if it doesn't go through some kind of test, because it's a complete nonsense. You know, it ticks a box, it's a box ticking exercise, and it enables policymakers to say we're meeting targets when we're not. So yeah, definitely.
I just wonder, Penny, if we could talk a bit more about how to actually make this shift, because anyone who's worked in urban regeneration and community-based research is completely familiar with the difficulties that you described very well, and the point that Paul is making here. So affordability, meaningful affordability, is something we are all aware has been a problem for a very long time. But how do we, what are the mechanisms to move beyond dialogue, where, as you know, we quite often come into conflict with people who kind of like challenge the idea that affordable isn't affordable. So what are the mechanisms to get past that very binary dialogue and to start thinking in meaningful terms about changing practice and changing policy?
Here, could I?
And yes, Paul.
I'm a former chair of the London CLT, so we worked on this on the basis that if we were to apply a market percentage to the way we priced our homes, we would always be in danger of the market over time creeping past whatever percentage we'd put on them, which was affordable. So we took a radical view that we had to relate the price of the home to local incomes. So the government every year produces information about what is the median income for any local authority area. And we've based the way in which we price homes on that median income. Because if it isn't affordable to local people on median incomes, then it's not affordable. So you've got a very clear evidence-based basis for calculating what is affordable. And there used to be a long tradition that households shouldn't be spending more than a third of their income on their housing costs. So again, we've worked out, if you're in Tower Hamlets, for instance, where the intermediate income is roughly £30,000, if you're only using a third of your income for your housing, you've got £10,000 a year for a mortgage. So you can work back from that to work out how much you're going to charge for the house. And that's the way we operated in order to create the pilot that was referred to at St Clement's. And that's the model that we're using across London now. So we're developing our own piece of work in Lewisham now, and we're working with about a dozen local authorities across London on developing more CLT homes. The question that somebody raised is, how can we do this to scale? Because at the moment, it's happening on a very small scale. And for this to be really genuinely affordable for a large number of people, we need to bring it to a much bigger scale. So that's the next step in the journey, if you like.
Great, thank you. And I'll invite the audience to kind of share their thoughts on this question of scale and examples from other places around the UK and the world. Just moving on, I'd like to take a question from Michael Edwards, who's in the audience, which is directly relevant to the question of CLT models. So Michael says, isn't it clear from Walterton and Elgin and Coin Street and lots of Swiss and Austrian examples that co-op rentals can generate really cheap housing for low-income people if the land can be free/cheap? the St Clement's model forces such tenants out? How about Carpenter's estate for a start? So I'd just like to invite you both to respond to that.
I personally feel as much the cooperative could be making a huge contribution down on the Olympic Park to something much more inclusive, and that land, this is public land, and the LLDC could dispose of the land to the cooperatives if it wanted to, and that would remain, it would ensure that the housing remained affordable in perpetuity as well. I think, which is a really important part of anything that's going to happen. Paul, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
Even with free land, that doesn't make the homes affordable. Our experience is that even with free land, as in Lewisham, where we've got a small development of, I think, 12 or 13 homes, we need a subsidy from the community-led housing fund in the range of 90,000 per unit in order for it to be a viable proposition. Of course, if you get larger scale developments, then you can share out the overheads across a larger number of units, in which case it makes the arithmetic a bit easier. But if on small scale, certainly, even with free land, it's not viable to do genuinely affordable homes on the basis that we're doing it without there being a substantial investment from the public purse.
That's great, thank you. I'd like to pass over to another panelist, my colleague Hannah Baumann, who will put this question live.
Hi there, thanks to all of you. That was really illuminating in terms of how certain promises that were made before the Olympics haven't been kept. And you definitely outlined the problems there. And I'm wondering, because you started with the Olympics and also with the fact that mega events in so many cities cause displacement and often non-sustainable regeneration. If you can situate this local situation that we see here in these global circuits a bit more again, because of course, as you were saying, a lot of times you have international investments that are going into these houses rather than allocating them to local people. So how can the borough or on the city level, how can London and individual neighborhoods try to take themselves out of those global circuits and operate on the local level? Is that even possible, or what kind of legal steps would have to be taken for that?
I mean, I think that, to be honest with you, there were some contradictory agendas at the time around how it would take shape. And so the London Borough of Newham, for example, was really, really keen to lots of money. So I think that they combined with the, so on the one hand, the GLA wanted, I think, 50% affordable housing, but I think we need to back and I think really develop quite a strong critique of mixed communities agenda, which can be a way of supporting market-led regeneration that results in this tendency to displacement and gentrification.
That's great, thank you. Can I kind of continue the theme of displacement by putting a question from one of our audience members, Hannah Sender. He says, thank you, Penny. You talked about displacement, which people tend to associate with conflict and persecution. Can you talk about how displacement in and out of London challenges our understandings and definitions of the term displacement?
I mean, I think there's quite a big literature now that has been exploring displacement as a kind of way in which government policies, particularly in the UK, have begun to push lower income families. In fact, even Boris Johnson himself referred to a social cleansing that would arise from a range of policies that were introduced in 2010, which would push low income households out of London. But I think in the case of the Olympic Park, what's interesting is I have a paper that I wrote recently explored this whole idea, the way in which the policies themselves have been formulated have reinforced exclusionary displacement by design. So there's the displacement pressures that have come through lack of housing, forcing people out. And then there's the actual policies of displacement that effectively, if you build a development that's got 30% affordable housing, and that's all shared ownership. That's displacement by design. So it's in a sense, it doesn't seem as brutal, and you don't see people being loaded up on buses and being moved out of cities. It's a much more subtle process where people, you know, are disappearing slowly through the communities. And again, when we were making our film, that was a very, very big issue of people, you know, communities being broken up, people having to leave their school, you know, quite kind of, but it's a kind of hidden, because what goes on in housing is behind closed doors, and people don't see the pain and anguish in a way of maybe something that might happen in a school. So it's very covert. It's a slow kind of slippery process of pushing people out. But policies are contributing, you know, a range of our policies are contributing to low-income households in East London moving from the centre to hanging on in the periphery.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you. That connects to a theme that emerges from our research in East London a lot too, which is the feeling of dislocation. So even though people aren't always immediately or directly displaced by new housing, the kind of dismantling of services and dismantling of networks around them creates a sense of dislocation and kind of shrinking, you know, of possibilities and experience within the neighbourhood. I'd just like to go to a question from Alex Brown, who's in the audience. So Alex says, for many families, let alone single people, getting social housing is like winning the lottery and just as likely. Isn't the only real solution to this to have a real correction in the housing market, instead of trying to buy more £1 million flats and houses and giving them away? Lowering house prices is political poison, but doesn't it make more sense than providing more housing at today's crazy prices? Alex notes that the Chancellor has continued the trend again of propping up the housing market to the detriment of most.
I think that if you go back 50 years, governments, political parties used to compete about who would come up with the best agenda for housing, because they saw housing as a public good. For the last 50 years, that's moved to a much more market position, where all political parties basically have regarded housing as a private good that the market can provide. We really need to go back to the sort of post-war consensus that housing is actually a public good, and that political parties should be competing for the electorate on what housing policies they can bring forward. And the post-war delivery of council homes was a sort of fantastic provision for a community that was in desperate need of housing. And the fact that we now have sold off, under Thatcher and subsequent governments have sold off council housing, is really the reason we're in the mess that we're in now. And we just have to reverse that whole, it seems to me, we have to reverse that whole political consensus and get a different political census around what housing is, a public good rather than a private good.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to go now to my colleague, Matthew Davis, who's on the panel, so he can put his question live.
Thanks, Saffron, and thank you everyone for a wonderful presentation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think my point was actually going to pick up on what Paul has just said, really. And I wonder if the phrasing and the terminology around affordable housing itself in many ways is part of the problem, because the idea of affordable to me seems to relate to the market in some way and seems to be related to the monetary value. And as you've aptly argued, that the value perhaps needs to rest in the use of and the purpose of the property rather than its market value. And it strikes me then that perhaps the real debates are about how we define use, value, purpose, and how we restrict, well, maybe not restrict, but how we define access to properties of different values and uses, etc. And that the monetary component, in a sense, then just becomes secondarily to that to make things work and operate. But the whole idea of affordability is not the real issue here. It's about access to these resources. And I would just wonder if there are any sort of further comments on that. And as Paul was sort of intimating, perhaps that takes us back to a much earlier phase in our understanding of what accessible housing is and who it should be for.
Thank you, Matt. Penny, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think affordable housing, I would echo what Paul, I think we do need to go back, and how we get back, I don't know, it's to some kind of consensus that housing is a basic right, it's a need, we all need it. And I think the affordable term is a red herring in a sense, because everybody needs affordable housing, don't they? Actually, you know, we all need decent affordable housing that we can grow in, have children in, and have the space to grow. And in fact, you know, we've moved so far to having housing as such a central part of our economy that it's so obvious yesterday that, you know, all of those measures to prop up the housing market again will be trickle up subsidies to people that least need it, whilst the majority or lots of people will remain kind of in kind of really miserable housing conditions. So yeah, I do think we need to have a different approach, but how you build a consensus to that when there's so much vested interest in the market and the financial dimensions of housing. I mean, we can see it on the Olympic Park, all of the vested interests, you know, the whole language around kind of not building too much affordable housing, as if it's as if people living in affordable housing have some kind of disease, you know, that kind of the disease model of poverty, that we put too many people together in council estates. That in itself is a problem, and that really needs to be challenged because it does not borne out by the evidence. Again, the previous mayor, that Robin Welsh, would stand up regularly and say that people in Newham don't get out of bed in the morning, and so they don't need too much council. You know, if we have too much council housing, it will create welfare dependency, and we really need to kind of hit back against that whole idea of welfare dependency.
So we're almost at 2 o'clock and we've nearly run out of time. And I actually think this is a really good moment to end, because we can end with this call for a kind of rethinking, reimagining, and going back to a time where housing was a public good, not necessarily a private issue, and this call for different kinds of narratives and innovation. So I'd just like to thank you very much, Penny, Paul, and Emmanuel. Hannah and Matt, and my other colleagues on the panel, we'd like to give you a round of applause and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.